Today on the Everything 80s podcast, Harry and the Hendersons. Hey there, what's happening? Welcome back to the Everything 80s podcast. I'm Jamie. Thanks for coming out. For as long as there have been stories, there have been legends. That's pretty much the premise to do with everything Harry and the Hendersons and mankind's love of Bigfoot or the Yeti or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. That's kept us enthralled over the years. Harry and the Hendersons was a live-action comedy movie from 1987 about a giant Sasquatch that ends up living with the Henderson family. It was a moderate success and would lead to a TV show that lasted 3 seasons. And that's what we're going to look at here today. Before we start, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe wherever you find your podcasts. I should be there. Okay, let's do it. Legends have existed for eons about, these giant creatures that may or may not live in the forests in various parts throughout North America. And then the Patterson-Gimlin film happened. You probably know which one I'm talking about. The one that looks like a guy in a gorilla costume walking through the forest. It's been perfectly spoofed from The Simpsons, that "Hold on, Bob, we can see your wristwatch," to the movie Elf. This movie or clip was filmed in 1967 in California, 38 miles south of Oregon. Standing at over 7 feet tall, Roger Patterson and Robert Gimlin saw this gigantic creature by a river and then walking upright through the forest in the video you probably know. Apparently, this was a lady Bigfoot and was named Patty. Whatever, despite whether this video was real or not, Patterson had just published a book on Bigfoot prior to this video, so maybe this served as the trailer for it. Either way, Bigfoot captured the interest of the public even more so than it had previously. Bigfoot would remain in the public conscious, and then George Henderson would hit one with his car, and that's where our story about Harry and the Hendersons from movie to TV show begins. So let's set the stage for this movie. So I was kind of enamored with this thing. I'm not sure what it was, but it came out in 1987. So I was about 10 years old and right at that right age to appreciate it. Kids, I think, will always be fascinated by things like Bigfoot, and the way he was depicted in this movie made it more approachable and even, seemed desirable. Like, who wouldn't want a Sasquatch in their own home that looked like this? The movie would be produced and directed by William Deere and would be set in the Pacific Northwest. This is where most sightings of Bigfoots tend to happen. The movie was filmed in the Cascade Range in Washington State and then also in areas around Seattle. The movie actually ended up requiring really high-end makeup to bring Harry to life. And they actually won an Oscar for best makeup, if you can believe it. So here's the plot of Harry and the Hendersons. George Henderson is a good family man, and after taking his family on a camping trip, he hits what he believes is a man in the family station wagon, which was a Ford Country Squire. The man turns out to be a Sasquatch, and fearing they have killed it, they take it home by strapping it to the roof of their car like Clark Griswold does with his Christmas tree in Christmas Vacation. George then finds out that this thing that sort of looks like Chewbacca is actually not dead. And the creature, instead of wanting to kill him, which it probably should have for, almost being run over, ends up being very friendly to them. They name him Harry, but they let him back into the wild. They then see more reports on the news of Bigfoot sightings, and a hunter who is trying to bag Harry as his prize catch appears on the scene. George tries to get back out there to find Harry. George is kind of like the plot of Elf for a little while. George tracks him down and saves him from the hunter, who then ends up being arrested. The hunter eventually gets out of jail, and the Hendersons take Harry to re-release back into the woods. The hunter tracks them down, but then the hunter has a change of mind after an interaction with Harry and decides he should live in peace. They all say goodbye to Harry, who has somehow learned to speak English and is able to say okay when they tell him to take care of themselves. It's like another bad Planet of the Apes prequel. At the end of the movie, Harry ventures in the woods where a bunch of other Sasquatches emerge to continue on with them. If you've ever seen the Star Wars Holiday Special, I beg you to see this. It's one of the worst things ever created on TV. You can find it on YouTube. This end scene is a lot like when all the Wookiees converge together at the end to celebrate Life Day. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you're just going to have to go see this, but just be warned that it's atrocious, but I think it's required viewing. Okay, let's look at some of the Harry and the Hendersons cast. John Lithgow, of course, plays George Henderson. Melinda Dillon plays Nancy Henderson. She was also in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. She has a cameo in the Muppet movie. Margaret Lankrick plays Sarah Henderson, who's a fellow Canadian. Josh Rudoy plays Ernie Henderson. He was in the movie Flatliners and appeared also in Alf, speaking of another puppet-based entertainment. He's now an investment advisor in Los Angeles. Don Amiche plays Dr. Wallace Wrightwood. He was also on The Love Boat, Fantasy Island, and he won an Oscar for Cocoon. David Suchet plays the evil Jacques Lafleur. He's in Canada and in French, Lafleur means flower. So I don't know if he got that nickname or that would have worked well, but it's a missed opportunity. So let's look at bringing Harry to life. So I mentioned, Alf and puppet-based entertainment, and like any giant puppet, thinking of things like, Jabba the Hutt, it takes a whole team to operate them. And it took a whole team to operate Harry. Physically, he was played by Kevin Peter Hall, who was 7'2". He was the in-suit performer in Predator, in the very first two Predator movies. Fun fact, Jean-Claude Van Damme was originally cast to play the Predator, and he actually plays him in the first few scenes in the very first movie. Hall was also on shows like The Dukes of Hazzard, Night Court, and he appears in Big Top Pee-wee. The rest of the team included Rich Baker, Tom Hester, and Tim Lawrence as puppeteers, and Fred Newman played the voice of Harry. Newman has done a lot of voices and sound effects, specifically in things like Gremlins, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, The Muppets, and you may remember him as one of the hosts of the new Mickey Mouse Club. If you remember the one that was in that sort of golden age that launched Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera and Justin Timberlake, he was the sort of grayish, silver-haired guy, like the adult host who did all those weird sound effects. Harry's head was basically a radio-controlled mask, and all the radio-controlled motors sat in the forehead. A joystick would be used off camera that could control every function of Harry, from his expression to mouth movements, even the eyebrows. 2 puppeteers would then be needed to control the lips, and 1 just for the eyebrows, like an over-the-top glam squad. Rich Baker was the man behind the whole design and look of Harry. And as important as the physical performance obviously is, it's really that look that brought Harry to life. Even if you just see, the mask of Harry just sitting on its own, it's already lifelike without even the performance. So that was really important. Baker was instrumental in the development of Harry because he just came off an American Werewolf in Paris, and he was seen as the only person who would be able to create a creature like this. The first sketch that Baker designed would be the one that would be the basis for Harry. It was also used, this sketch, in the movie when George has to submit an image of what a Sasquatch really looks like. Okay, looking at some of the production on Harry and the Hendersons. The cast apparently were not sure what Harry would actually look like until filming started, and a few had mentioned in interviews that they found him frightening and in shock about how lifelike this thing seemed. William Deere had the tough job of trying to create a ferocious creature, but at the same time draw the humanity out of him. You had to initially be scared of Harry, but then realize he could be like a house pet. This may be part of the reason why Harry has a bit of that, cartoony looking face. So it's almost like that goofy smile. Ultimately, you needed to feel sympathetic towards him and see him as more human than animal. While shooting the movie, it was important that they kept Harry from being seen, as they wanted the full reveal of him to appear on screen and not beforehand in newspapers or magazines. This meant having to keep closely guarded sets. During the freeway chase scene, a large amount of the public had come out to watch and trying to catch a glimpse of what Harry was actually going to look like. Some people were able to get a quick look, but thankfully in a pre-phone era, or even digital cameras, none of the images were leaked. So even if 50 people saw him, it didn't mean anything because no one else was going to see him. Harry and the Hendersons was originally intended to be a sitcom at first, and a 25-page script was written for it. William Deere believed it would work better as a movie, as no one had taken the direction where Bigfoot could actually be a likable character. Okay, so now we look at the release of the movie and some misunderstandings. Harry and the Hendersons was released on June 5th, 1987 on a budget of $10 million. It opened on a pretty big weekend at the same time as Beverly Hills Cop 2 and The Untouchables. It not surprisingly finished third to them, pulling in $29.8 million. Overall, it would make $50 million in its run. That's around $113 million converted for today. So an okay-ish hit, but nothing crazy. It was the thought that keeping Harry away from being seen beforehand or used in the trailer or any promotional items hurt the success of the film. The producers wanted people to see how amazing the creature looked on the big screen and not spoil it prior. The public thought that the creature either looked too hokey since they weren't showing it, or that it was barely going to be featured in the movie. There was also the sentiment that people didn't even really know that this was a movie about a Bigfoot. Since nothing beforehand was showing there was a Sasquatch in the movie, the title would be changed in other countries where it would go as Bigfoot and the Hendersons. This was done so people would realize that the Bigfoot was the main character in the movie, something that was lost on American audiences. So now the movie eventually, is recognizable and it's considered, I don't want to call it a hit, but everyone's familiar with it. So that would launch into the Harry and the Hendersons TV show. So I'm trying to, I'm mostly focused on 80s related things and movies, but it's worth making note of this TV series. And I love this show. I don't know what it was, but again, I don't know if I was just at the right age for when this was appealing to me or if I was in the right audience. Since the movie was originally created around being a sitcom, the basis for it, it makes sense that they turned it into one. The movie itself, again, it has a very sitcom-y feel to it already, and it could naturally translate over to the small screen. What we're basically dealing with here is kind of another version of Alf again, or E.T., as it's a story of a creature living with a normal family, and they have to keep it a secret. It starts with a whole new family, and the only carryover from the movie is Harry being played by Hall, who is the main guy inside him. The show came out on January 13th, 1991, and ran until June 18th, 1993. It was put out by Amblin Entertainment and would span 72 glorious episodes. The premise of the show follows the same concept of the movie, with the Hendersons made up of George and Nancy with their kids, Ernie and Sarah. This time around, the new cast included Bruce Davison, who was playing George Henderson. He was also in Willard, if you remember that movie. Nancy Henderson was played by Molly Cheek. She's been on Family Ties, Murder, She Wrote. She was Jim's mom in American Pie. Sarah Henderson was played by Carol Ann Plant. Ernie Henderson was played by Zachary Bostrom. He was, I don't know if you remember, A Very Brady Christmas. He was in that. The difference in the Harry and the Hendersons TV show was that George and Nancy were pretty middle-class based couple who both had jobs. George worked at a sporting goods store and then would eventually start a magazine. They had someone who would help with Harry named Walter Potter, and they had their usual next-door neighbor. There was a bit of a Harry being in a Steve Urkel situation, if you ask me, and even the theme song of the show, Your Feet's Too Big by Leon Redbone, has, again, a very Family Matters feel to it. A lot of people were aware of Harry's existence in the show, but you pretty much had to if you're going to crank out multiple storylines. So kind of the same thing with Alf, when you take this premise of they're hiding this thing and it's, how are they going to disguise them or keep them under wraps? You can only do that for so long. Eventually you have to bring in other characters and then other, sort of crossover storylines to make this thing work better. And that whole issue is what leads into the second season, where they basically just said to hell with it and let Harry's existence be known to the world. Harry becomes famous and an overnight sensation in the show. This is basically, if you ever saw Escape from the Planet of the Apes, this is basically the same plot line that's following. But as I mentioned, I really like this show. I like that we were seeing the real Harry costume and not a cheap knockoff. it was just like the movie coming to your small screen. And even in the end credits of the show would often show various scenes from the original movie. Here's another fun fact. Scott Baio was actually one of the directors of this series. So was Frank Bonner, who played Herb on WKRP Cincinnati and appeared on, shows like Who's the Boss, Saved by the Bell, and Night Court. And I don't know, the fact Scott Baio was one of the directors, it just really changes this show to me now. Okay, so what about Harry and the Hendersons 2? Probably safe to say a sequel to this movie will never happen. It's even hard to find information regarding it, but there were some links online talking about a sequel called Harry and the Hendersons Return to the Forest. But I wouldn't hold your breath on this. I actually could see this being rebooted in some sort of Netflix series, though. Netflix seems to take a crack at anything that's had somewhat of a proven track record in the past. And that's good because they don't have to create a ton of original programming. I feel it may have the ability to work, at least from a nostalgia standpoint, like how Fuller House had. I could see this being either a Netflix movie, or I honestly think another series would work, because I think people would just remember sort of fondly Harry and the Hendersons and would check it out, or just for a new audience, the concept of a Bigfoot living in a house. I think this is a possible good idea. I don't know if we'll ever see it like that, but as a Netflix series, I could definitely see this happening. Okay, I'll start winding it down here. And again, like referring to that nostalgia factor and why I think that could work, I think Harry and the Hendersons is remembered fondly by everyone. It was a unique approach for a movie, but one that was pretty heartwarming. They were able to capture a real personality to Harry and draw you into the world and the characters. It's still jarring to me to think of that scene where George slaps Harry to get him to return to the woods for his own safety. So they were able to kind of create this sort of emotional connection in the movie and tug at the heartstrings a little. And ultimately, I think Harry and the Hendersons worked. It could have been a disaster of a movie. And the only thing that prevented it from being more successful was that approach they took to promoting the movie, which ended up backfiring on them. It would live on home video, and that's where I'm sure you probably got to see it at some point, and that's what would generate more appreciation and regard for the movie, and where it did ultimately find a bigger audience. So it has become, more of a beloved movie that people remember. And then that obviously would lead in to the TV show for the 3 seasons. So it was able to establish itself in pop culture at the time, which, ultimately means I'd say it is a success in the long run. So I'll finish it there. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed looking back at this. This might have been a favorite movie of yours, or one that you hadn't thought of in a while, but hopefully found this entertaining. I'll be back soon with a new episode. In the meantime, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe wherever you find your podcasts, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.